would demand for land, not just jobs, education, and housing, but land. See, we never say that 79 of this 79 started in the committee changed the whole plan, but I understand. I have contact. I was called from Atlanta, Georgia, just last night, and up to now they're going ahead with the march.
And Reverend Abernathy, I believe, is taking Dr. King's place as the head of the Christian Leadership Conference.
Right.
Have you had a chance to speak with Dr. Abernathy?
No, not yet. However, I am invited personally by Reverend Abernathy to speak in his church in the very near future, a week or two, and I will be speaking to him.
And you are expecting then that from all over the country, the minority people will come to Washington over a period of time?
Yes. The Mexican Americans, Spanish Americans are uniting and recruiting people, just like the Indians and the black people, for this great march.
Well,
this was called by Martin Luther King campaign for the poor, the March for the Poor People.
I seem to recall that when he announced this march, that he said something about the fact that this would be the last massive attempt to convince the government and the American people by nonviolent means, and that if this was not successful, that he would not try again.
Right, yes, his philosophy had changed. His last speech, closed-door speech, was plain. He said this march would not represent civil rights, but human rights. For the first time, the black people would ask for land, would demand for land, not just jobs, education, and housing, but land. Just like the people in New Mexico are demanding land.
Well, perhaps we could talk now about what you are doing in northern New Mexico, how it started. You yourself were born in Texas, I believe?
Yes, in Falls City, Texas, September 21st, 1926.
In a field?
In a cotton field, yes, ma'am.
And you were your mother's fifth child?
I was my mother's fifth child, yes. It was around between 4 and 5 o'clock in the afternoon when my mother and my father was picking cotton, and the pains arrived, and it was there that I was born in a cotton sack, half full.
See, I have a good memory. I heard you say this once before. And you grew up where?
I grew up around the San Antonio area up to 14. Then I left for the beet and tomato fields in Ohio, Indiana, and Michigan. At the age of 17, I started in a theological seminary for 3 years. I graduated, and then I was a minister for the following 10 years in Arizona while we were...
A minister? What kind of a minister?
Non-denominational, Protestant minister.
But your family were agricultural workers, and you yourself worked in the fields as you grew up.
That was my trade, yes, field work.
When did you go to New Mexico?
I decided to... I had been there before, but I had refused to join the land claimants, the people that had been fighting and with the federal government and claiming certain rights under a Treaty of Guadalupe that was signed between the United States and Mexico, February the 2nd, 1848. However, picking cotton in the fields of Arizona, the neighbors burned my house and 16 other houses of my fellow brothers who together had decided to build a little village called the Valley of Peace. In the period of 3 years, they burned our house, our church, our store, our school, 17 homes. After
who burned them?
The neighbors, Anglo-Americans, civilized Anglo-Americans.
Why?
because we refused to send our children to their school, and because they thought we were communists. And Don Pelton, the FBI agent, was called to investigate. He refused flatly. Lawrence White, the sheriff of the Pinal County, was invited, or rather asked many times to come and investigate the burnings. He refused flatly. And he was there, and then that we decided to move into New Mexico, and that burning, destruction of our property, changed part of my life and the course of my life. From Bible, religious teaching to civil and international law and land, which is what is involved in this whole struggle.
Now, the current struggle which is going on, as I understand it, concerns 6 counties in northern New Mexico.
Well, really, it concerns the whole state. The land, we sometimes mention the 5 counties because it's where we make up the 90% of the population, and because we are face to face with federal government, and because the Department of Agriculture is there where it's holding most of the land that the President of the United States confiscated outright from the villages. However, the land grants, 350, are scattered throughout the whole state of New Mexico.
Yes, but the fight is concentrated for the moment around this particular area.
Right, but the members of the organization are scattered throughout the state and also Texas and California. But the showdowns, what we would call them, and the real trouble is in the northern part, yes.
Well, how did it start? I believe I recall something about the fact that at some stage you decided to take over a village.
Well, to understand this and to inform the public, which has been deprived of the truth through the CBS and UPI and Associated Press, who have been distorting the truth, I would like to state that the people of New Mexico, like the Hopi Nation, have never surrendered to the confiscation of the land, have never surrendered to the federal government and to their ideas, who are against, which are against the 300-year-old system and way of livelihood in New Mexico. There is a group, there was and there is, called White Caps in the northern part of New Mexico. As the government built fences around this common land that belongs to the villages, during the day, the people cut the fence during the night. On and on for the last 100 years. The government have conspired in 1,000 ways to destroy the life, the culture, the language, the property of these people. He has not succeeded because he has not succeeded in pushing the people out of the northern part of New Mexico. So, it was 1957 that I decided, when my property was burned, that I decided to investigate the claims, the cries of the people. I discovered that even though there were many pueblos, many people, they were not united. Every pueblo was for himself, just like the Indian pueblos. My first step after discovering that they held a true claim, and that the treaty did stipulate the protection of such land, and that they did have the title, and the villages had title to this land, I decided to organize and unite the people of the various land grants, which are called pueblos. It is these pueblos who hold the land, who owns the land, not the individuals, not the heirs. The heirs hold certain right through the village, through the pueblo council or city council, as more popular called. And in 1963, after due and through investigation, I decided to organize the Alianza Federal de Mercedes, Federal Alliance of Land Grants, which was whose papers and documents were confiscated by the federal government in 1967, and then we decided to dissolve the organization and convert it into a political organization, which is now called Federal Alliance of Free City-States. The fight has been going for the last 120 years. It is not true that we started the fight. In many local papers, it has been proven and written in the front page that the problem or the trouble did not started with Tijerina. It was there, but the people had not succeeded in bringing their claim, their cry across the nation. See, the nation was ignorant of this organized conspiracy and criminal confiscation of the federal government against the people. It was there, and it has been there all the time. But the public has been kept ignorant of this fact. Only the local bankers, politicians, and rich men and ranchers know the fact. But they, in collusion with the news media, keep it quiet. Until now, they could no longer do it because the Alianza broke through the silence barrier. It was when we were to hold a meeting, a nationwide meeting in Coyote, New Mexico. Coyote is the Spanish word for coyote. So it was there. We published it in news media, radio, press, and TV for a month. But there's a man that is being used by the senator of New Mexico, Senator Montoya, who wants to make a name for himself, and the news media provoked and teased this man by calling that meeting at Coyote a showdown day meeting between the people and the government. So making the state police believe that there was going to be a shootout, the district attorney Alfonso Sanchez decided to put all his resources and call the chief of police, Joe Black, and call all the state militia, state police, block all the roads and start arresting everybody on the grounds of unlawful assembly. Naturally, the people were too strong, too brave to swallow such a stupid accusation and grounds for arrest. They were enraged, they were angry, and in this state of anger, the following day after the mass arrest, they decided to arrest the district attorney. They were furnished with a warrant of arrest, official document signed by the alcalde, the mayor of San Joaquin, the deputies and the volunteers who went to Tierra Maria, the next town, to arrest Alfonso Sanchez. It was a plain citizen's arrest. It was turned out into a shootout because of the state police. At that day, there were a hearing was being held for the Alianza leaders that were being tried. And, of course, the following was published throughout the nation and the world, that there was a revolution going on in Tierra Maria. Governor David Cargo, whose wife is a member of the Alianza, was in Michigan with Governor Romney, George Romney. Immediately he was called and took a special army jet to fly back to New Mexico. In the meantime, Mr. Francis, the Lieutenant Governor, summoned the National Guard, State Police, 150 mounted police, and they brought in 3 battle tanks and helicopters, airplanes, and so on, and the whole state was turned into a state of confusion, and even the Air Force in Albuquerque, Kirtland Air Force, Sandia Air Force, all the personnel were pulled out of the air base into the city of Albuquerque because they have been threatened to telephones that they were going to be bombed. Even the state penitentiary was triplicated their guards, and the whole state was in a state of confusion.
This all started because a conference, a meeting was going to be held?
Yes, in Coyote, New Mexico, right. Yes, they sabotaged our meeting, and naturally the people, well educated, they refused to allow stupid men temper and fool around with our rights, our constitutional rights. See, in New Mexico, the people have been educated through the radio. We have a daily radio program, daily. We have been teaching our people the rights that have been frozen, sabotaged by the federal government, the rights that were practiced by these people for 300 years. and rights that have been barred out of school. See, the Spanish language, traditions, and culture, and certain perpetual rights that we hold have been frozen completely.
And all of these rights, I want to get this clear. The original Treaty of Guadalupe did reserve to your people these Pueblo lands and certain rights.
Yes, sir. Yes.
And these rights have gradually been removed. Is that
frozen. The government has never legally dissolved any right or any pueblo whatsoever.
What was included in those rights? The right to your own schools and
language, the cultural rights, which includes the language, property rights, which includes the mode of or the way of living that is concerning the property. See, we held no property individually, but a little home and a little garden. We could not hold over 150 square yards for ourselves. It was a pueblo, the village, that held all the land in trust for the villagers. So naturally, the government comes and respects the Indian pueblos, but the Spanish pueblos, he freezes them, confiscates the land, converts it into public land or a U.S. forest land under the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Interior. So naturally, that was an outright theft. We therefore accuse the federal government.
And did this take place gradually, or was it done sort of?
Yes, gradually. To start with, the public has not been told that after the treaty was signed, our government took full responsibility as our government to protect our lives and our property.
All right, group team. Dre 2024, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can't hear you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yeah.
All right,
you cannot.
One moment. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, wow. I can't hear you, but that's okay. We're going to go ahead and keep going. Let's see if I can fix this as we are moving forward. Welcome to the Liberation Library, where we are exploring the work of Reies Tijerina, worker, fighter, revolutionary, working on land rights reclamation. Let's go ahead and get this party started like we always get the party started in the Liberation Library with our centering exercise. Sit or stand or just be still as you are able with your feet firmly planted on the ground. Imagine that the balls of your feet are extending from your body, deeply rooted in the earth. We'll talk about that today. Connected to the other people on this watching this broadcast in this metaverse room, either in this moment or in the future. Relax your shoulders and swallow a couple of times. We're going to breathe in by our nose and out of our mouths, always using our throat for this breathing and centering exercise. Breathe in as long as possible. Breathe in as slowly as possible and breathe in as deeply as possible. Let's breathe together. Inhale, breathing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Hold it. And exhale. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Release. Inhale 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Full expansive lungs. And exhale 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Release. Our deepest breath of the day. We're taking it as one community, all connected. Inhale 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Hold it. And exhale 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Release. Open up your eyes. Come on back to center. If you are joining us on LinkedIn, please activate the chat as you feel able. Dre 2024, I hope we can hear you. Let's try this one more time. How did that feel today?
Can you hear me now?
And I cannot hear you.
Ugh. Can you hear me now?
Dre 2024. I don't know what's happening right now with the speaker. I cannot hear you. Let's see if our listeners can hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, you can be heard on the LinkedIn. So let's just do that.
Okay,
Yep.
got it.
Our listeners can hear you. So I'm gonna fix. I want to work on fixing my audio and go ahead and talk to us.
Okay, hey everybody. I definitely appreciated, obviously, I always say this every week, I needed the time to just slow down and breathe. Especially with all the things that are happening right now. I think it's really key and important to
So Dre
really take the
2024. How did that breathing feel?
Okay, hey everybody. I definitely appreciated, obviously, I always say this every week, I needed the time to just slow down and breathe. Especially with all the things that are happening right now. I think it's really key and important to really take the.
How did that breathing feel? Yeah, this is going to be kind of weird today, but we're going to keep going and figure out what's happening. Let me do this. Dre 2024, can you let me see. You can hear me. I can't hear you. Let me do one more thing. I'm glad you all are actually being so gentle as we are watching this practice in public. Let's do this. Da, 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 da. Let's see this. All right. Can you hear me now?
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
All right, let's do this. All right, let's start over. How did that feel? How did the breathing feel for you today?
It was great. I did a double because I did also do breathing exercises this morning. I even did like a little bit of hypnosis this
Ooh.
morning. So it has been really good just to set time to just ground, especially with everything that is going on right now with the news, politics, music industry, New York.
Oh yeah.
There's just a lot going on. So got to take the time to really just breathe a little bit. With the news last night with our mayor over here, Eric Adams, like I just felt like everything. I felt dizzy. I just felt like there's so many things happening. I'm just like really, our power structures are crumbling in such a way, and I just think, I have to take a moment.
Yeah. So let's stay there for a second because I think that how does it feel? I mean, I'll share some of the things that are coming up for me, but I'm just curious. You're in New York. There are a lot of things that are happening, and I'm just using your words. You said our power structures are crumbling. How does that feel? How are you reacting to that? You said it makes you feel dizzy. Let's stay there and tell me more about that.
Yeah, I think just like, I think it's good that like a lot of the corruption and things that are really harming people are being exposed. Feels like, it's, I mean, not that it's all coming to light, because like I feel like many of us could have predicted some of these things that happened in the past, and we continually talk about it every week. And it's just, I think it's dizzying because it's just like, this is an election year. There's just a lot of conversation going on. And then also, like, I was telling a friend the other day, like, what you believe in, and what you're like, what you care about and what you want to fight for, but like when you're just surrounded by all this noise, whether it's social media or the TV media, podcasts, and all these things, and it just like really clouds your brain, and that's why I use the word dizzy.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that there's a lot of noise and a lot of distraction, and I think this is so
Yes.
It's like
Yeah,
how do you know where and who to pay attention to and who to listen to, especially like when your childhood idols are like crumbling before your eyes. And I'll tell you, it's interesting watching, what's happening with a certain music mogul. Like that was the soundtrack of my college, right?
yeah,
Like those were the jams, and it's like, huh.
yeah.
Um,
And I think also like in addition to that, Teach Hit Accelerator, like I live in his hometown,
oh.
so it's like when we were younger, we definitely had the narrative in our city was like, oh yeah, that mogul's from here. Like
Mm-hmm.
there's like like a sense of pride in the early 2000s around it. And so like now that this is like what the news is, it does feel a little um it feels like a lot because like we used to be proud of that.
Yeah.
And so it's a little bit and I love that you use the word distraction. There, like, it's hard to stay focused, and I'm just saying that transparently as like someone who reads and watches the news and all those things, and it's hard to stay focused on things because just so many things are popping up
Mm-hmm.
at the time. So
Yeah. So you said your practice of staying focused is like you do breathing, hypnosis. Is there any other strategies that you use to stay focused and I guess practice your skill of discernment?
yeah, so I do a lot of conversations with friends.
Okay.
And we actually, in our conversation with the friends, we kind of like do this thing where we talk about what we see, and then we say like, well, is it real or not? Can we believe it? Like, because what we do is like we talk about like media literacy around like
Mm-hmm.
where's the source coming from and all that stuff. And then I guess the other strategy, like, to be honest, sometimes you just got to turn it off. Like
Mm.
I stopped scrolling Twitter at a certain time, and then also like I started muting different things on Instagram because you just need a break.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. Um, you can still hear me, okay, right?
I can hear you.
Yeah, so I think for me, it's my yoga practice keeps me centered, breathing and closing my eyes. But I do think like this is a time where there's so much happening, and there's so many different, I won't say news sources, but media sources, and figuring
Yeah,
out which media is a part of how do I say it, a more unifying story, right? Because like there's
yeah,
always going to be certain stories, but I think it's so important to stay centered, stay healed and healthy, so we'll know which stories are designed to tear us apart and which
right,
stories are designed to bring us together. And sometimes the stories that are there to bring us together, that coming together might not be always pleasant.
right.
And it,
I also just wanna sorry, go ahead.
no, 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 you go.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, aside from the stories that are happening here in New York, there's like other stories that are popping up, like the 76er stadium that's being built, or that they're trying to approve a stadium that's being built in Chinatown in Philadelphia, which means
Mm,
like they're going to destroy a part of historic Chinatown to make sure that this is there. The mayor of Philly just not made an approval for it, but kind of was just like I'm for it, and like people are angry about it, so I see a lot of that. And then let's not forget, y'all, like outside of the U.S., there's so much
oh
happening
my,
outside.
yeah,
Like, and that's why, again, T28 Accelerator, I appreciate the word distraction, because it's like there's this, there's that, there's this, there's that, and it's like, okay, like you're trying to keep your focus on, especially in our fight, and like
right.
it's more than just us, and it's more than just certain things, but yeah, it is it's distraction. I love that word that you used.
Yeah, yeah. So let's get down to the work. Today we're continuing our conversation about Reies Tijerina, the Federal Alliance. Let me see if I get the name right. Federal Alliance of Free City States. In his work, his cause was around land rights and land reclamation. So I want to start there and just generate some ideas and conversation about that concept because that concept is universal. I think we could, take many of the conflicts, because any conflict that removes people from land is one that also threatens the
Mm,
sense of culture and identity.
mhm,
So let's just talk about that core point. Like, I know your family came from the Philippines to America. How many generations ago? One or two?
one.
One.
You're the
Okay.
first one.
They're the first ones. So, like, let's talk about, and my family, descendant of enslaved Africans, and our relationships with land have been quite tumultuous.
Mm,
Trying to be taken away from one land, but knowing that their roots there, and trying to establish a sense of belonging and culture, in a land where, for generations, the position was you belong, but only in a subservient position,
mhm.
and not as equal, definitely not as owner, and not as full citizen. So I think I know in my body that the relationship with land is deeply connected to culture and identity. But I want to hear from you, like, how does that show up for you, and your lived experience and your family's experience of relationship with land?
Yeah, so I'm honestly like I'm just learning about like Filipino American history, and also just the history of the Philippines in general. When we think about land, I think about like the country of the Philippines, colonized by Spain and then colonized by the United States afterwards, and then we were given, and you guys can't see me, but I'm putting air quotes, independence. Um, from the United States, but we're still a neo colony in essence. Like there's so many American influences in the Philippines um, that the culture of the Philippines is kind of mishmashed. And so I'm learning a lot of things that are more ancestrally Filipino versus like traditions that are mixed from the colonization of by Spain and by the United States. But with that being said, when I talk about my lived experience, I feel like sometimes it's really hard as a Filipinx American to really pinpoint like land that's ours,
Mm-hmm.
or like because we're just not aware of what the
Mm.
history is, and we're just kind of like going by like what our parents tell us, which in some essence I'm learning to is still like like I said, my parents were the first to come to the United States. Like a lot of our practices like seem um Americanized, and I'm not gonna
Yeah.
lie, like I mean, I'm learning how to come back home to myself. So um yeah, it's different in many different ways.
Yeah, I could not agree more. What's coming up for me, Dre, 2024 is, I don't know if you had a chance to read. I'm still in a vulnerability hangover by talking about coming out of my cannabis closet. Um,
Mm.
and what'd you say?
I need to read that article. I like liked it and I like saved it. So I need to.
Yeah. It's like, wow, I feel like my adulthood is like coming out of all these closets, like, publicly. But, like, one of the things that has been incredibly powerful for me, as the beneficiary of all of the hard work and the bloodshed of hundreds of years of struggle, is the disconnection with land that I now have. Um, and for one, it's like knowing that my grandmother's level of independence was deeply connected to the relationship with the land. I don't remember, trips to the grocery store. What I do remember is sitting on the porch shelling peas. I do remember, having hogs in the back. I do remember there being chickens. Like, so the level of being able to sustain yourself on land is deeply, deeply cultural. And that's my mom's people. My dad's people, land was such a huge part. Like, especially during the Emancipation and Reconstruction era, like, all my ancestors are buried in the same place, right? At the same church, on the same land. And what's interesting to me is, when you remove a plant from its soil and you put it in another bed of soil, using plant analogies, the plant's going to try to live, right?
Yeah.
It's going to try to live, and it will live if that soil is nutrient dense, if the plant is given water, if the plant is given sun, if the plant is given everything to live. And I think that what we might have missed out on is when people are displaced and have to be replanted for whatever reason. The fight to live is real, it's human, but the resources to live might not be as are not as available to everybody, and I think that creates the levels of conflict that we might be seeing and experiencing in our daily relationships. What do you think about that? Do you agree? Do you disagree?
Oh yeah. And I think too, I love the analogy with plants. I just like that analogy because it's just kind of like when you think about like even ourselves, like as we go to different environments, whether it's a new city or it's a new like college, like everything is an adaptation in a way of like you're fighting and trying to survive or trying to live, and it's just like how do you transition it from moving um from survival to thriving,
Hmm.
because sometimes when you look at plants too, right, like you plant them and then they don't make it in
Right.
that particular environment. So it's like where the like I don't want to call it the resilience piece, but like there's that, and it's just interesting to see how that unfolds in like different forms of life.
Yeah, and I think the resilience word is an okay word to acknowledge as long as we don't place the blame on the plant for dying. Right?
Mm,
It's
yeah,
like the plant. Everyone's. I would argue everyone's will to live is there once they're transplanted. The question is like, does the new environment create the conditions to thrive?
mhm,
And and I think like that is some of the those are some of the insights that have come up for me, in my plant growing journey. It's like, oh, I can move this plant. Will it survive? And do I know all of in what ways do I need to change my own habits to create the survival? Because I had a role in its displacement,
right,
right? I had a
right.
role in this displacement. And so let's get back to Reyes Tijerina. If you are joining us on LinkedIn, you can activate the chat. But what we're going to do here is that we played a little bit of the recording of his words talking about his struggle between 10:45 and 11 o'clock. But now you're just going to hear some of the words from during 2024, and I talk about the connections to the work that we're experiencing today, the work that's in schools. And let's go ahead and get started. So I want to just one remind folks that they can get full access to these resources in our Liberation Library that's designed to inform the public, right? So where we left off, Ray Tardino was telling us that civilized Anglo Americans burned his house down,
Mm,
burned our house, our church, our school, 17 homes, and he said these were his neighbors, Anglo Americans, civilized Anglo Americans. So he qualifies that word Anglo American by civilized during 2024. Why do you think he did that in the speech?
like share, like you mean like share that his house got burned down?
Oh no, but say he said these were my neighbors, Anglo
Oh,
Americans, civilized Anglo Americans.
I think he shared that to showcase that, like, you know, the people around you. I think one, that people around you are could possibly thinking different from you or thinking something about you, and then also just naming a little bit of like the colonization piece too with the Anglos um taking over and trying to burn down his land.
Yeah, I also think I was like, if you're burning down someone's house, you're not civilized, y'all.
Yeah, yeah.
That's not a mark. It's like that's not neighborly if you're burning down somebody's house. And the author goes on. I mean, the interviewer goes on to ask him why, and he says, "You want to read that one for us about
Uh,
because?"
because we refused.
Yeah,
Because we refused to send our children to their school, and because they thought we were communists and Don Pelton, the FBI agent, was called to investigate. He refused flatly. Lawrence White, the chair of the Pinal County, was invited, or rather asked many times, to come and investigate burnings. He refused flatly, and it was there. And then we decided to move into New Mexico, and that burning destruction of our property changed part of my life and the course of my life from Bible religious teaching to civil international law and land, which is what is involved in this whole struggle.
Yeah. Whew. What did it feel like to read that, and what's coming up for you as you reflect on that quote?
Yeah, I often think, well, when something happens, to us, particularly in this country, sometimes where they just refuse to investigate, or it just goes ignored. And then the second one is the phrase where he says, it changed part of my life and the course of my life from Bible religious teaching to civil and international law and land. And how much I think about often how much religion is weaponized
Mm.
in a lot of situations. And so it just helped me remind me about that.
Yeah, yeah. He's like, oh, this might. It's so interesting because he was a trained seminarian. He's like, oh, this got me this far, but y'all just burn my house down.
Right.
Like, I gotta do. He's like, when I read that, it's like, oh, I need different skills to fight this fight. Um, so I want to go on a little bit more, as Dre 2024 said, like they refuse to send the children to school. But as we go down, he talks a little bit about the formation of the Federal Alliance of City States. And I just want to read this particular quote because I think that there's some incredible insights that we can draw from the past to connect to the current present. And then Reies Tijerina goes on to say, and then we decided to dissolve the organization and convert it to a political organization, which is now called the Federal Alliance of Free City States. The fight has been going on for the last 120 years. It is
Oh, wow.
not true that we started the fight in many local papers. It has been proven and written in the front page that the problem or the trouble has not started with the hyena. It was there, but the people had not succeeded in bringing their claim, their cry across the nation. See, the nation was ignorant of this organized conspiracy and criminal confiscation of the federal government against the people. It was there and it has been there all the time, but the public has been kept ignorant of the fact. Dre 2024. What resonated with you? What rose to the surface as you listened to that particular quote?
Yeah, so the part where it says the fight has been going on for the last 120 years, first of all,
Yeah.
and then second, it is not true that we started the fight in many local papers, but and then going to the end where it says the public has been kept ignorant of the fact. How we've talked about this so many times here in the metaverse around narratives and stories that are being shared and things that are being passed on from generation to generation or person to person. Like the fact that he mentions that the public has been kept ignorant. How many times have we heard that
Mm,
in our storylines? And then the fact that even I just heard of this person when we were introduced to him 2 weeks ago.
yeah.
Um, is it? That's part of the game. It's
Mm,
you really do have to seek these stories out, and I think that's why it's important that one, we do share these stories, and two, how do we uplift these voices in a way that doesn't keep the public ignorant of the facts.
yeah. Yeah. I agree. And I think we're gonna get to the implication and the potential role of educators and schools in this. But one of the things that is resonant with me is the humility to acknowledge this has been going on for 120 years, right? He's like before I was even born. And I think sometimes it's easy to slip into oh, this is about me and my fight, and not recognizing that actually the work that we are doing is standing in a long lineage of people who are trying to make our country a more perfect union. And too often those people are demonized. They're called, they're investigated by the FBI. And I think that is also a part of the narrative that we have to hold, because not, there is a cost to education, right? There is a cost to knowing, right? there is something about it, the saying like ignorance is bliss. Like sometimes it's like I don't want to know.
Hmm.
And I found myself, in that position when I was, a certain music mogul where the depositions and the indictments were running around. I was like, I don't want to read that. I
Right.
don't. I was like, I know enough. I don't want to know.
Right.
How do you feel about that? How do you navigate what to learn about and what not to learn about to keep yourself one healthy but two informed?
Yeah, so I let myself read the facts, but to the point that you said, like there's just some things that I'm just like, I don't need to know that. I know what happened, like
Right.
generally, like I know the overview of the case and I know the overview of the things that are happening. I don't necessarily like to read all of the details, um and that's fine with me.
Hmm.
As long as I'm aware and that I can still um I know enough to be able to participate in the fight, I'm good.
Yeah.
Um so to your point, yeah. And also like I think, one thing that I really love about this space and the space that you've created and the space that you've created, especially around this dialogue, is that the recognition that we're all human and
Mm.
like we could be grieving this, like to the point that you said, like, this is someone that you listened to, um, you said high school, college,
Oh, beginning
high
of
school,
high school, yeah, it was the jam.
yeah,
Oh my
high
gosh.
school, college days. And then for me, like, this is someone that was just like prided in my hometown. Like, and everyone was so proud that he attended our schools and like things like that. And so like of course there's a stages of grief and what he did was horrible. But I mean not but we're also going through it at the same time.
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
and so yeah, but the fight still continues.
Absolutely, absolutely. Tejerina goes on in 16 minutes into the interview. He says only the bankers, politicians, rich men, and ranchers know the fact, but they were in collusion with the news media to keep it quiet.
Can we talk
Uh,
about that?
yeah, yeah, we can talk about that. Yeah, what's coming up for you? Yeah.
The I mean, we know this in our society today, like rich people like seem to know everything.
Mm-hmm.
Um and it's interesting because actually I heard about this. Like this is just an analogy. So I was listening to a tennis podcast, and a guy who was really famous, former tennis player, Grand Slam winner, said that if you're someone who's really popular and just really famous in the tennis industry, you have the money, and because you have the money, you become friends with a lot of the journalists or whatever, you can control narratives.
Mm-hmm.
That's in sports. Okay. Like if you don't want someone to talk about like you switching your coach out of nowhere, or like there's something happening behind the scenes, you can control that narrative. Unlike people who don't have those resources and privileges, like they're going to write the story about you.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so then if you want to connect that to politics and the way that our country is run, like I mean, we see it like in terms of like um, campaigns, and when people are accepting monies, like people really move away from their values because of donations and who can
Mm-hmm.
contribute. If you know that a certain group has a lot of money that they're willing to donate to your campaign, you might change your political view
Mm-hmm.
or your values just so that you can attain that money. And so that's why I think it's funny where it talks about like people with money and people who have power, like obviously know what's happening,
Yeah.
and they control narratives.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's also, this might be controversial to say. I think it might also be easy to say that could never happen to me or you. But I think it probably at some point, those folks never thought it could happen to them either.
Right. Listen, it's funny you say that because it's just like, oftentimes we do see a lot of things and we're just like, no, I would never.
Right.
And I would never. But like you don't. I mean, we don't know until we get there. Like, not even that we don't know, but like until our values and our things get tested.
Right.
Um, to see like what do you care about more? And I think, but that's the point 228 accelerator that I think I think we've been talking about all along. It's like, what will distract you? What are they doing to make sure that um, that you get distracted so that you go along? An example that I want to bring up is like the Chinatown situation in Philadelphia, the 76er Stadium.
Mm-hmm.
Someone posted this and I was like, wow. Like, I mean, I thought about it, but like until somebody posted it, I was like, oh, I didn't really think about that. But like, think about like when you knock down a historic district like Chinatown that has predominantly Chinese immigrant elders living there. And the way that they're framing it to people is, oh, if we have the 76er stadium, there's going to be this many jobs. And
Mm-hmm.
someone posted, oh, so you're trying to pit us against each other by saying like, forget about them. If this goes here, you'll have a job. And
Right.
I was like, oh, right. So, and then, that's again where you get tested.
Mm-hmm. And it's like you'll have a job at what cost? And I think like with our, and I'm not going to say I have all the answers, but I do think that having saying like, can we, create economic opportunity without displacing people? I think
Yeah.
we can figure that out, right?
Yeah.
Because displacing, like my dad and mom were like, hey, here's a code to live by. The strong should never take advantage of the weak. The rich should never exploit the poor, right? And it's like you have an older community. It's like displace them. Where are they going to go? These are the last beautiful years of their lives. They're connected to that land. And just to think that, if you're 80 or 70, you can just pick up and go someplace else, and that not affect you and that's just naive, right? It's naive.
Right.
Um, one of the yeah, I think I'll save that. I was going to say something, but I'll save that comment for the next broadcast. I'm going to go to exit 5, and he's talking about educating the people. So I'll read this out loud, and as I'm reading it, if you're listening, just think about what this means and how this is connected to today. He said they blocked the sabotage, our meeting, and naturally the people, well educated, they refused to allow the Superman temper to fool around with our rights, our constitutional rights. See, in New Mexico, the people have been educated through radio. We have a daily radio program. Daily, we've been teaching our people the rights that have been frozen, sabotaged by the federal government, the rights that were practiced by these people for 300 years, and the rights that have been barred out of school. See, the Spanish language, traditions, cultures, and certain perpetual rights that we hold have been frozen completely. All of these rights, I want to get it clear, the host says, the original Treaty of Guadalupe did reserve your people, the Pueblos' lands, and certain rights. He was like, yes, yes, sir. Yes, and these rights have been gradually removed, the host says. Yes, frozen. Tijerina goes on to say, the government has never legally dissolved any right or pueblo whatsoever. Um, and then the host asks, what was included in those rights? The right to your own schools? And Reies Tijerina says, and language. Well, the culture, the culture. Cultural rights, which include the language, property rights, which includes the mode or way of living that is concerning the property. See, we held no property individually, but a little home and a little garden. We could not hold over 100 square yards for ourselves. It was the pueblo, the village, that held the land in a trust for the villagers. I'm going to stop there because that was a lot. Dre 2024, what is coming up for you? What are you hearing? What's resonating in your body as you hear this?
Yeah, this again, like when I was thinking about indigenous people
Mm-hmm.
in our country, where when they were here first, they were removed off their lands, placed into they're called reservations. Yeah, reservations, and um, the erasure of language and culture,
Mm-hmm.
and what that does. And like I think that often that often happens in a lot of just not colonized countries, not just ours, but around the world. When they had the age of exploration and colonization, when they came there, they just got rid of, or they tried to get rid of like all the culture and the languages so that everyone speaks whatever the main language is, and then what ends up happening is like a fusion of the languages. But it made me think about that, because even though sabotage federal government, the rights were practiced by these people for 300 years.
Yeah.
I don't
So
know, like, yeah.
what do you think about, because I'm sure that, a counter argument could say, but, you know, 300 years was 300 years ago. How is that showing up in your body now? Like, why is it such a big deal? Like, what would you say to that person, who is, um, yeah, what would you say to that person? That's their argument. Like, why does 300 years, how does 300 years impact your body today?
Um, there's a book that you recommended to me, My Grandmother's Hands,
Mm,
um, where the trauma just passes on. And even though there are moments that you're like not, like you're not fully aware of it, like there's like the subconscious level too of why you feel a certain way, or why you feel like you're not enough, or you just don't feel like you belong in a certain space. Like part of it is like upbringing in your environment, but all sometimes some of it is like cellular. And I'm pretty sure I
mm,
read that in Audre Lorde's The Master's Tools booklet, around like things are cellular. They're
yeah.
in there. And I mean, I think she even talks about in that book about like when you're thinking about coming back home to yourself, like the ancestral, like a lot of this stuff is ancestral knowledge. It's
Yeah.
like how do you find it and bring it back? And so I think I would tell that person like, um a lot of who we are has been erased. It's,
Mm, mm,
it's like 300 years, yeah, like that was 300 years ago, but like we lost ourselves in the process.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
A lot of us are in a process now of trying to come back to that.
I
Um,
think, yeah. Yeah, I could not agree more. I think, some of these issues are so very complex, that we do need to lean on other discourses, and other ways of knowing, and other zones or domains of expertise to understand them. And I think, I'm in these wisdom school classes, and one of the insights that's been just very, very resonant and transformative for me is understanding that the heart as an organ it has a um it has physical attributes and purpose and function that we can see and we can measure. When we measure it by pulse, like, ejection fracture, EKGs, like we have all these tools to measure the physical function of the heart, but the heart is also an organ of emotional perception. And
mm,
it's also an organ of spiritual perception. Now, that would never, like, the function of the heart through that lens never would come up in traditional medicine because we don't have the tools to measure its impact or its function that way. But other discourses could create insight to see it. But, and in one of the classes, one of the teachers said, and as an organ of spiritual perception, it's able to sense things beyond the realm of time.
mm,
So we have this organ in our body that can connect 300 years ago, um, and can connect with other realms. And just because we cannot measure it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It means we cannot measure it.
right.
So I think that's another way to think about when you have or see people, who don't quite belong, but seems physically okay. That, could there be a space where they don't feel, well, is displacement or playing a role? Like
Mm,
they, I'm failing to find the right words. But I know there are a lot of people on this particular land that we are sitting on today where this is not their homeland.
right.
And I think a part, what'd you say?
No, no, keep going.
And a part of figuring out how to thrive is, how do I integrate both? Connect to my ancestral ways of being, of the past, and also, figure out how to navigate that in the present that has its own ways of being and making sense of the world without those two going to war in my body.
Right.
Um, I'll stop there to see what you're thinking, what that brings up for you.
Yeah. So when you talked about like, things are not in the homeland, like, or doesn't feel like we're in the homeland, um, I thought about when I asked this question to my parents a long time ago, like basically like if you got to do it again, would you come here? And they were like, no.
Mm-hmm.
And because like and I just learned about this the other day. I attended friends like dissertation about like Filipino nurses and how they were used in in the plight of like the promise of like moving here, and they were paid pretty poorly and like all of the rights, etc. And I thought about how like I'm pretty like I'm sure that my father did say like, oh, like the narratives of like what the United States was, like everyone talks about it as like it's this and this, and then you come here and it's like, oh, actually like um it's not as great as I thought it was going to be. And there are like trade-offs too. Like he talks about like obviously like my brother and I definitely have it different. We have a choice of like what we're doing and things like that, and so um it's very complex to just think about the situation too.
Yeah. As we're coming up to the end, I definitely want to um, talk about the role of schools and education in this particular moment, given the work that we now know about Reies Tijerina, and the idea that a lot of us, whether we were displaced hundreds of years ago or we were just displaced yesterday, and this let's talk about what the soil needs to look like and feel like and what nutrients need to be in the soil for to grow in a new place.
Right.
And I think just continuing and following the analogy in that way, uh, the soil can be our classrooms, the soil can be our schools, but let's just like use this frame of a pot. We have these beautiful humans that are plants that are now that are now connected to new soil.
Right.
Dre 2024, let's talk about the nutrients that have to be in that soil for us to, in other words, live the future we want today. What do you think?
I think you mean like in terms of like when you say like the nutrients, you mean like schools?
Well, yeah. Like, so if we use the metaphor that we were transplanted, like all of us are now on this soil. It might not have been
Right.
our home soil, but it might have been but it has been our home soil for at least 30 years, 100 years, 120 years, right? I would argue not everyone is thriving.
Right.
Uh, not everyone is thriving. So, like, let's talk about what the soil has to have in it,
Oh
um,
yeah.
so
I
we can
think
thrive. What do you think?
yeah. So I think one is that and I say this I think a lot, or we talk about this a lot in every week, where we talk a little bit about like um what is how sorry not what is how are we coming together to be in community with each other.
Mm,
Um Lots of division, like I think right now what's in our soil is division,
hmm
and like they're throwing in a bunch of pesticides and things to make sure that we are all divided and that we continue to stay divided
hmm
and we continue not to know about each other. But how do we come in community with each other? How do we hear each other's stories and find commonality in those stories? Because every time we read something in the metaverse, even though I know for me as a Filipinx, and as an Asian American, like even though not all the stories are directly related to people in my heritage or my culture, I find commonality in all of them.
hmm
Like I find the commonality in struggle. And so I feel like we need to hear more of these stories and learn to find ways where we can talk about them so that we can see we're all in it together.
Yeah, yeah. So I definitely think that the soil has to be rich with diverse nutrients, right?
Yeah.
A lot of different stories. I also think like there's some really important, just like fundamental parts of life, like clean water. Uh, I was
Right.
reading this article in the New York Times, and it was like, yeah, so. We need some drought resistant plants because there's not a lot of water, and our and the impact of our culture and our food systems is having on the environment. So I think, like, you know, all life needs water, clean water, and you shouldn't need a lot of money to get clean water. What do you think about that? And how do
So
and how do we get schools that like hold that? Like that's important, fundamental.
right. So, we talk about, I think, firstly, like, I think we've also said, like, the like, I think we've read articles where they talk about, like, basic housing and
Yeah,
food and things like that. And I think when we talk about this in schools, it's like, well, first, like, before kids enter our classroom, right? Like, did they have breakfast? Did they
yeah,
eat? And then secondly, like, um, are we checking? Like, I know social emotional learning is such a buzzword, but, like, are we checking mental health, emotion before we start? Like, those are all foundations before learning.
right.
And I think it's interesting because, like, back in 2012, 2013, when I first started, like, yes, we checked for those things, but what we often had, like, we're portrayed to do in a lot of trainings is, like, you got to push through. You got to push
Hmm.
through. And I mean, I think that was what I was brought up with too, is like, no matter what's happening, like, you got to keep pushing through. You got to be resilient.
Yeah,
Um, but I think, especially today, like, we have to check how we're doing.
yeah,
Like,
absolutely.
so yeah.
I think about there's this app that I don't have it on my phone yet, but my spouse Michelle has it. And it's the one where you can, I think she has it. You can take your phone and take a picture of a plant leaf, and
Oh
it will
yeah, yeah.
tell you what's wrong with the plant, right?
I think I've seen that.
What'd you say?
I definitely seen that.
Have you used it?
No, I haven't.
Yeah, and sometimes I think that that's a great analogy to what it means to have an equity lens, right? So when you have an equity lens, you can look at a human and
Right.
say, this human wants to live. This human wants to grow. There's something that's not working. Not with the human per se, but with the environment that the human is planted in. Does the
Mhm.
human, does the plant need more water? Does it need more phosphorus? Does it need, which nutrient is required? And I think that's what an equity lens really means is like, can you look at life and determine what's needed to grow and thrive? And are you willing to do it? What do you think about that? Do you think there are some connections there?
Like, connections between what?
Like
Sorry.
just being able to look at, like, we can look at plants, and we have tools to diagnose illnesses in plants
Oh,
very
yeah, yeah,
quickly
yeah.
with our phones and our devices, but we don't necessarily create the same level of ease or grace, I guess, in this looking at humans, frankly.
Right. I thinking about that, like, I feel like as an educator, sometimes that, like, you want that skill, like, that you want to look at a student and just be able to be like, what is going on, so that I can help them be the best person they can be so that they can learn in the classroom.
Yeah.
Sometimes those things are super complex.
Yes.
Or some of the issues are so complex, but the problem is, as you know, is like, we don't have enough supports in the school building to support that or to do that. And oftentimes I feel like sometimes teachers, we don't have enough training or support to be able to deal with some of this.
Hmm.
And so I think, to the point of, like, do we need, I think in terms of, like, being able to identify it, yes. And also, like, where can we get all the supports to make sure that we and the child are successful in this process. And sometimes, a lot of these issues, I think about a lot of the stuff for myself too, like, they take years to heal.
Yeah.
um, and so it's super complex in comparison to, like, thinking about, you could just pull up an app and, like, check what the plant needs.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that the headline that I'm walking away with this conversation is, what is within our control, right? If we have a lot of different humans that have been forced to be replanted, that have chosen to be replanted, that the pot has changed on them depending on how the borders of the pot have been changed or distorted. There are all ways that we can make the soil nutrient dense to support growth. And I think stories are a part of that. I think choosing, making sure that we all know of the struggles, that this is not a new struggle. This has been going on for 120 years, as Reies Tijerina said, or, the ways of the Pueblo people that had their land taken, the ways of 300 years, right? That's 300 years of culture, of language, of identity, and it's incredibly hard to move people without having those parts of the self disrupted. And then to want growth is, it's almost as if, like, for real, like
Mhm.
we're talking about this, but I don't even know who I am. So I think that the sensitivity there is required. I think that's a part of also developing the equity lens as we are, going into this very, very tumultuous, not just election season, but, as Grace Lee Boggs would say, on the clock of the world, things are changing.
Right.
On the clock of the world, things are, remember that song by Snap? It's getting kind of hectic. That might be before your time, but it's like it's hectic. It's hectic in
Yeah.
these streets.
It's chaos.
So yeah, I think that might be one of the ways that we can start to look at each other, especially, when we are seeing people who might not agree with us, who might have had different life experiences. It's like, oh, I wonder what soil you were raised in. One of the things that I'm writing a piece about cannabis, and doing the backstory on the first drug czar. I was like, there was no way for him to be any better, given the
Right.
stories that we grew up with, right? I was like, dude, you were born when Homer Plessy was arrested. Like, miscegenation laws were on the books. Like, to be who he was a function of the stories that he digested. So, and I think that this is why more stories are so important, so that we create the possibility of fully grown humans that can that can spread and grow and thrive. We got 5 minutes left. Dre 2024. You got the last word.
Yeah. So I think today, like, again, what I think I've taken away from this is like the importance of making sure that we continue to like uplift and emphasize these stories. Like one thing I was thinking about was like if I was still teaching today,
Mm,
how that I would use this in a unit about home. I think
mm.
a lot of times home is fantasized or romanticized, and it should be, like we should romanticize where, like, how we think about home and how we find home within ourselves. But there are also stories of home, as we know, that are stories of where you have a home and it's taken away. And I
Yeah.
think this is a very good story to counter that. The romanticizing of home, like there are real situations where people created community, built these beautiful structures, and built these places so that they can find belonging and so that they can create a community. And how many times did other people feel threatened by that and took it away because
Mm.
they felt threatened by it, or they didn't want you to have that piece. And so I would definitely use this in a unit, I mean an ELA unit about home, like let alone history. Like for sure, like this should come up in history, but as an English teacher, like putting this as like a narrative around homes.
Yes, and what happens when you never find home?
Right. Mm,
And how do those feelings come up in your body?
yeah.
And and what do we do when not having home or not finding our home makes us sad all the time?
Right.
And I think that could create a more humanizing way to look at, the human condition and struggle, in a way that doesn't demonize people, and it humanizes them, even with that displacement that we don't understand. Dre 2024, thank you so much for your engagement, your honesty, your humility today. We're going to be back in the month of October with um, gosh, as we're moving out, I think our next one will be another feature for Latinx Heritage Month, and then we're moving into Disability and Ability Awareness Month, and would just want us just to continue to look at each other with a humane, loving, growing equity lens. This is Dre 2024 and 228 Accelerator with the Liberation Library. If you love these resources, check us out at exdcommunity.org, where we have an entire liberation library with the stories that give us the nutrients and make our soul rich and inspire our own holistic growth. We will see you all the next time. Thank you so much for listening.